Today, we've got a really important guest, Jeanette Rowley from the Vegan Society, talking about something super important for vegans to understand, and that's the government's prevent strategy. Basically, brackets vegans with terrorists potentially, which sounds completely crazy. So, Jeanette, can you explain all, what all this is about?
The vegan rights advocate at the Vegan Society. And I would just say, first of all, that I'm not an expert in the UK's prevent strategy, nor the UK's counter-terrorism strategy. What I know is basically the research I've conducted following some vegans contacting me to complain that they seem to have fallen under the radar of the UK's anti-terrorist strategy. The prevent strategy, the counter-terrorism strategy, doesn't actually label vegan activists as potential extremists or potential terrorists. The idea of vegan extremism seems to be more widespread on social media, and it's definitely not in any policy documents, government policy documents. But animal rights activists are and have been for quite some time.
Separate categories, are they? Because a lot of people would describe themselves as both or animal activists. And, with the extremist framing, I remember I came across that with something that the NFU, the National Farmers Union, had said about zero tolerance for animal rights.
I have two things going on. The first thing is a general counter-terrorism policy strategy devised by the UK government. And the second thing is a very specific counter-extremism policy that involves animal rights activists. And this takes us back to the 1980s when there was a lot of animal rights activism that was considered to be extremist in nature. So there was criminal activity. For example, some activists were targeting scientists at laboratories. They were throwing bricks through private homes, scientists' homes. They were also contacting the neighbours of scientists. They were sending things through the post, such as used toilet paper and razor blades. Animal rights activists were labelled as extremists and ready to engage in criminal activity to further their political aims. In the 1980s, there was a Mars bar hoax. Animal rights activists publicised that they had poisoned Mars bars throughout the UK. This kind of behaviour caused widespread condemnation, and the government became very concerned. In 2004, Tony Blair's government decided that animal rights activism needs to be curtailed. And Tony Blair and David Blunkett actually wrote a paper, Animal Welfare, Human Rights, Protecting People from Extremism. Now, in that paper, Tony Blair and David Blunkett related animal rights extremism to terrorism. And they did say there that a tiny minority of animal rights activists would be dealt with by terrorist legislation if it was necessary. So there we have the relationship made between animal rights extremism and terrorism. And that's because of the definition of terrorism. The definition of terrorism is an action or a threat that is designed to influence the government or intimidate the public. Its purpose is to advance a political, religious, or ideological cause, and it's associated with serious damage or serious violence against a person, or it endangers people's lives, serious risk to public health and safety. So it's terrorism is serious criminal behaviour endangering. Strategy is one element of the UK's counter-terrorism strategy, and that's the prevent strategy that vegans seem to have come under the radar of. Strategy was to be disseminated among all people who would have care or control of vulnerable people who might be exploited by extremists or terrorists. And the training was delivered to public sector workers such as teachers, social workers, doctors, youth leaders. This call one day from a public sector worker who'd just left a prevent training session. And he told me that vegans had been listed as a group to watch out for under the Prevent strategy. I was really surprised and shocked because for me it's a very inappropriate use. There is no mention of vegans in counter-terrorism strategy or policy. In Blair's government, they put a lot of animal rights activists in prison. By 2011, there was some recognition that animal rights activists may in the future require a terrorist response. But generally speaking, the view currently is that animal rights activists don't pose a threat. So it was a bit alarming for me to find out that vegans would be considered to be a threat.
The training, he was working in the public sector, and he was a vegan, and he was getting this Prevent input, how to be careful with vulnerable people, watch out for vegans.
Yes, watch out for vegans, yeah. With no authoritative basis at all. He did follow up with me a few weeks later to let me know that he'd complained to the training provider, and the person responsible had actually apologised. But he didn't feel very, very much better because the 250 other people in that room hadn't received an apology nor a clarification that vegans weren't a group to watch out for. So the public sector workers, the teachers, youth leaders, social workers in that room would have left and probably still and probably still have a view that vegans are a group of people to watch out for under counter-terrorism policy. I then had another situation where a vegan parent was baking biscuits for a school fair, and during selling the biscuits, they were talking about where certain ingredients come from. And soon after the school fair, he was told that he would no longer be allowed to sell the biscuits at the school because a parent had complained, and there was now a formal investigation into his behaviour as extremist and potentially radicalising young vulnerable people by talking about where ingredients come from. So that was quite alarming as well, because again, the legislation was meant to prevent serious criminal behaviour. It was never meant to catch people in their ordinary course of life behaving in responsible, age-appropriate ways. The outcome of that was that the parent is permanently banned from selling at the school fair. That was the outcome. Involved in these kind of investigations, and they feel very anxious and nervous because of the seriousness of the allegations. And it doesn't.
1 minute you're sort of like selling your biscuits at your child's school and having a bit of a chit chat about the undesirability of, say, milk and eggs, and the next minute, I mean, what you've had a letter or an email or it sounds like
to say that, yeah,
it sounds very
to say that you've been investigated for extremism and radicalisation of vulnerable young people. Yes, all complaints about radicalisation or extremism have to be taken seriously by anybody involved with the care or control of young or vulnerable people. But they certainly would have been to some Prevent training, and if they've been informed that vegans are a group to watch out for, then perhaps they consider vegans to be a potential risk.
Didn't you say something about in one of our other conversations about somebody accused a vegan of emotional terrorism?
Yes, that's right. That's another one of the complaints I've had. I had a call from a company. I think it was somebody in the HR department, and she wanted to know whether or not the company could stop people talking about veganism or animal rights in the workplace because somebody had accused a vegan of emotional terrorism, which was a new one.
Was there another case, I think, that you mentioned when we talked before about, was there somebody that had a problem with their actual job?
A public sector worker was suspended pending an investigation into extremism and radicalisation. And this was an extremely difficult time for the employee. A few weeks of severe anxiety, obviously stress, worry because of the severity of the allegation. In the end, there were no consequences whatsoever, and the person just resumed their employment. But it was a very difficult time for this person. It was to do with communication, and again, it was a very responsible age-related communication. And I did have evidence of the communication, so I can verify it was age appropriate. It wasn't extremist in any way. It was basically just talking about the facts of veganism, what veganism is, the value of veganism. It wasn't talking about animal rights activism or animal rights in any way. It was talking about veganism. So it was more alarming. The situation might be where a youth club, youth leader talks to someone who comes to the youth club about veganism, and other people get involved, and then they go home, tell the parents, and then the parent complains to the youth leader, and so the youth club officials then start an investigation. And again, as I said before, this is considered to be a really important process because of the general safeguarding duty. So where there's a safeguarding duty combined with the counter-terrorism strategy, that the prevent duty, when those two things come together, animal rights activism or indeed veganism, is taken very seriously. What does concern me is the counter-terrorism policing signs and symbols information given to the police. And I have seen veganism represented on this document. So although it's not in any policy, it is in a way brought to the attention of counterterrorism police through these symbols, publishing of these symbols. This is a document produced by the counterterrorism office, and it's a list of symbols that they think are useful for counterterrorism police to know about. Now, obviously, their priority is counterterrorism. They're not interested at all in lawful campaigning or lawful organisations. But here we see animal aid and
everybody, Anonymous for the Voiceless, the Save Movement, Earthling Ed, Badger Patrol, Shepherd, you name it, they're there basically, aren't they?
And also the vegan flag. Now, the vegan flag doesn't have an organisation associated with it, so presumably knowledge of the vegan flag, if someone's wearing the vegan flag or holding the vegan flag, I mean, that would indicate to counterterrorism police that there is a potential threat there. I don't know what threat they would consider that, but obviously the counterterrorism police are educated on these signs and symbols. And I think when counterterrorism police are looking at these symbols, they're looking at them thinking about the potential for threat.
You can just imagine sort of like innocent people with a couple of badges or sort of, embroidered sort of like logos on their jackets, or stickers even. This could be maybe a sticker on their car. Then they could use that in the right kind of like circumstances and perhaps call some sort of account for themselves. I mean, it's quite extraordinary, isn't it?
It's unusual to see the publication of these signs and symbols when there is no government recognition that any of those organisations pose any threat whatsoever. In fact, the counterterrorism police have said that those signs and symbols don't represent unlawful or extremist organisations. They are just there for the police to know about lawful and unlawful organisations. But the fact that they are on a counter-terrorism policing publication means that police officers associate those symbols with potential threat, or should keep in mind that there could be a potential threat. I think it's surprising to find those symbols published at a time when animal rights activism itself has been stated in policy documents as posing no security threat whatsoever.
It enables the state to kind of like throw a bit of a large net over potential quote unquote troublemakers, people that might be seen as troublemakers. Very concerning. And, this has impacted real people's lives, as you've said. people who
Yes,
have been
absolutely.
in
Yeah.
their workplaces who felt they were,
Mm,
just legitimately talking about their own, you know, whatever their own life, and then they've sort of like been nobbled by, as you say, sort of like weeks of stress, horrible emails or letters, and something that's actually impacted their life and their relationship with that community probably forever. He seems to know who's giving the training. I mean, these people are, it seems, are they just randomly brought in to give the prevent training, and what sort of knowledge do they have of any of the areas targeting so-called hate groups, radical Islamic groups? So there's a kind of fascist kind of groups as well. So that's the sort of
mm.
bracketing, isn't it?
What needs to be made clear, is that there are criminals in society, and they can be religious or non-religious. They can have different ideologies, and they can have political campaigns. But not everybody who's involved is going to be ready to engage in criminal activity. And I think there needs to be a lot of common sense around this prevent strategy regarding dealing with complaints about vegans. Importance to have a look at what's going on, but perhaps not label it as immediately as extremism or radicalization, because I think that's where the alarm starts with people, that they've been, alleged to have engaged in extremism, radicalization, before they've even had a chance to say what they were doing.
Societies change all the time, and a lot of the ways that societies change, whether it's with civil rights, women's rights, or indeed say animal rights, is by people actually protesting, and people maybe taking action, in a way that seems extreme, um, in
Mm,
the context of the society as it is at the time, and then later
mm,
they're hailed as, yeah, where would we be without the suffragettes, American civil rights movement, fantastic, Nelson Mandela, in prison for
mm,
decades, then became, an actual, almost like a saint figure. So today's so-called extremist or terrorist can actually be tomorrow's savior, or, you know,
definitely. The difficulty, I think, is the where the police have power to interpret, and or where public sector workers have the power to investigate, interpret and investigate, and allege or accuse people of doing something that they haven't necessarily done. And I think that's where we need to have clarity, so that innocent vegans aren't brought into this wide net.
if some vegan finds themselves in a sort of like problematic situation, or is perhaps concerned about these sort of, they find themselves, the subject of some sort of like investigation, they can contact you at the Vegan Society.
Hmm. Yes, they can contact me through the know your rights at vegansociety.com. So on an everyday level, I would say vegans have got nothing to worry about at all.
I feel very concerned about it. I feel it's like potentially the thin end of the wedge. It's one of those things. It could be sort of like, it all sounds quite like it could be quite fluffy, but it could be sort of like ramped up. If they want to target certain groups, including vegans, we are very targetable.
The definition of extremism, then, is vocal or active opposition to fundamental values. And those fundamental values are all about respecting other people, tolerance, democracy, and doing things in the right way, that, a democratic society. So radicalization is defined by the prevent strategy as the process by which a person comes to support terrorism and forms of extremism leading to terrorism.
They're all super loaded terms, aren't they? I think, once you sort of like start to talk about values, I mean, there's so many different sort of areas at which, what is seen in consensus, the dominant cultural values of, say, be kind to animals, are being flouted
Mm,
with every single day, as sort of like, tens of thousands of sentient beings are sort of like shuffled off to the slaughterhouses, to be basically tortured to death. So
mm,
I think it's, they are the extremists. I would like to reframe it as the animal users who are torturing animals to death on a daily basis are the
mm,
extremists. They are
mm,
terrorists. They are the ones that
mm.
are in a war against other beings, not just against other beings, but against the planet, in terms of catastrophic
Mm,
breakdown, biodiversity loss and all that.
The government's view is that these behaviours are normal, they are traditional, and if you want to change things in society, then you have to do it according to a democratic process. So the British values that they talk about are democracy, the rule of law, individual liberty, and mutual respect for each other, different faiths, different beliefs, and so on. And what they want is for animal rights activists and vegans to engage in a democratic process.
Oh well, then that's all right then. I think I think that it's been really helpful for you to explain everything because there's a lot to sort of like get your head around with this one, and there's sort of like nebulous terms: extremism, terrorism, radicalization, all of which sound like really kind of like badness, like total badness. That you sort of like get the vegan badness or problematicness sort of like stuck on top of it, and then you've got the prevent thing. And I just think it's interesting to hear about it from somebody that's actually working with people that have been affected in real life, because real people in real life, as you say, have been affected, and real people are going through this training, and real people have been going through this training will be talking to their family and friends. And again, maybe pointing the finger, oh, that was a radical sort of like, oh, these vegan extremists. People just, people sort of don't think about things. They just sort of, you know, pluck out a few concepts and sling them all together. There you have the vegan terrorists, the vegan extremists. As I said, like the National Farmers Union saying, zero tolerance for animal rights. Nobody seems to have challenged that.
There is no reference whatsoever to vegan extremists or vegan radicalizers or vegan terrorists in the policy documents. Animal rights activism is still referred to in the policy.
Jeanette, it's been absolutely fantastic for you to explain.
You're welcome, Pamela. I'm not an expert, but I'm happy to share the research I've done, because obviously when I first heard about a vegan being accused of radicalization extremism, it was horrifying. It was absolutely horrifying. So I needed to understand how this has happened. And I can see that it's happened in a context of confusion around terms, difficult concepts to define. Some concepts aren't legally defined, but they're defined as working definitions, and a general history of trying to deal with serious animal rights activism.
And as a long-term vegan and somebody who's working for the Vegan Society, you know a lot more than practically anybody else about this sort of thing. Right. Well, thanks again, Jeanette, and
you're welcome, Pamela.
great talking with
Thanks.
you.
Thanks for inviting me. It's been lovely.